CloudGuard provides unified cloud-native controls for all of your assets and workloads, allowing you to automate security everywhere. CloudGuard's threat prevention capabilities protect application and workloads throughout the software development lifecycle, from code to cloud. Today I'll be discussing Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management.
The goal of CIEM is to reduce your attack surface by ensuring that cloud entitlements or permissions adhere to the principle of least privilege, which in turn ensures entities are only granted the smallest set of permissions needed when performing their task. The overview provides the most complete and comprehensive findings with drill down, filtered by entitlement misuse, misconfigurations, intelligent logging analytics so that you can quickly focus on what means most. Widget displays inactive users and roles, overly privileged entities, and in addition, sorted by severity and top talkers with activity trends. The overview delivers more than just your typical out-of-control findings focused on IAM and resources. A CIEM finding is not solely reliant on compliance and posture analysis. We understand the entitlement relationship and take into account policies and permissions directly or indirectly attached, such as assumed roles, organizational SCPs, and boundaries. We then compare the permissions granted versus permissions actually in use using intelligent audit activity to identify excessive permissions. The Identities and Resources area provides a single location into understanding the permissions and entitlements of your cloud infrastructure. Selecting the Permissions tab allows us to examine the permissions granted to the entity, and we are presented with a powerful visual aid showcasing policies attached to the role and their policy types. Important to note are the two new areas, permission status and IAM sensitivity. Permission status provides a quick indicator on permissive policies, and we'll touch on that later. IAM sensitivity is a score-based metric presenting the sensitivity of the IAM permissions that are granted. Clicking on the AWS service type, it then highlights the policy pane so that you can understand exactly what is allowed on that service. You can view the original policy as well as the effective policy. The effective policy corresponds to the effective set of permissions granted by the policy when taking into account those organizational SCPs and permission boundaries. If they exist, they would appear in the map and any potential overlap of statements within the original policy. Let's look at a role with multiple policies. You can start to see the increase of complexity, but don't worry. By selecting Consolidated Policy, you're presented with a consolidated view of the permissions effectively granted to the entity, taking into account all the policies directly or indirectly attached to it. As we move around each service area, the map provides a quick visual aid into the effective permissions, actions, and resources. Notice how we're presented the information as a table and not as a JSON file. This is another platform feature which builds out an artificial policy so that you can quickly focus on normalized data that is easy to ingest. In AWS, it is possible to define trust relationships between roles. This is referred to as role chaining, and it practically means that a role can grant permissions from other roles to the entities that assume it. CloudGuard shows policies obtained via trust and takes them into account when calculating the effective policy of the role. In the policy pane, we see permissions directly and indirectly attached, displaying the effective permissions granted. Just to recap, we went over that CIEM provides you with the visibility into cloud entitlements and calculates the effective permissions of cloud assets. CIEM automatically takes into account multiple permission policies, granted roles, and compares permissions granted versus permissions used when identifying excessive permissions. Now that we've seen how CIEM analyzes and identifies entitlement misuse, let's move into the overview screen and inspect an overprivileged finding and how the context we saw earlier helps customers quickly assess and take action. When we select a finding, two important options are immediately available. The first is suggested role policy, which are the set of permissions needed to ensure least privileges. From here, we see a drop-down that allows selecting a policy to see how it should be remediated. Second is the eye icon, which shows redundant permission findings with the original permissions as well as those recommended for review. The severity of the finding depends on the sensitivity of the excessive permissions. We are also providing another important piece, which is displayed in the analysis period, which indicates the relevancy. This is the period for which we looked at activity logs to determine which permissions were in use. Clicking on the entity name opens up the entity in question, and we are presented with a consolidated overview into the engines and protection capabilities around this particular entity. As we saw earlier, the Permissions tab allows for further analysis and discovery, streamlining the research needed and moving towards a least privileged methodology. In conclusion, CIEM helps you understand easily the effect of permissions granted to an entity and how that relationship extends into cloud objects and multiple role assignments, providing clarity to what has often been a challenge for many of us today. I hope you found this useful, and thank you for your